June 1941 marked a dramatic turning point in the Second World War. Under a veil of early morning mist, Adolf Hitler's forces launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive and meticulously planned invasion of the Soviet Union. Only 2 years earlier, Germany and the USA had signed a non-aggression pact, a strategic agreement that shocked the world, and, for a time, kept the Eastern Front quiet. Yet, in a bold and ultimately disastrous move, Hitler chose to break that pact. Over 1,000 miles of frontier, German troops and their allies surged forward, igniting one of the largest and bloodiest military campaigns in human history. This was not a decision made in haste. Hitler's inner circle of advisors had repeatedly warned him about the immense challenge that lay ahead. They cautioned that Germany's resources, already stretched by campaigns in Western Europe and North Africa, might not withstand the demands of an extended war deep inside the Soviet Union. The logistics alone supplying food, fuel, and ammunition across such vast distances were staggering. And yet, convinced of a swift and decisive victory, Hitler pressed forward, believing that a quick strike would cripple Soviet power before the harsh Russian winter could set in. As the first waves of German soldiers crossed the border, the speed and scale of the offensive shocked the world. Cities and villages fell with alarming rapidity. The Wehrmacht's panzer divisions raced across the plains, supported by relentless aerial bombardment. Soviet defenses were caught off guard, and early victories gave Berlin the illusion that their gamble would pay off. But beneath the triumph, cracks began to appear. The Red Army, though battered, refused to collapse. The sheer size of the Soviet Union, its unforgiving terrain, and the resilience of its people would soon test Germany in ways its leaders had never imagined. The invasion of the USA was not just another chapter in the war. It was the start of a titanic struggle that would shape the destiny of Europe and redefine the very nature of global conflict. What began as a lightning strike turned into a grinding war of attrition, a war of mud and unimaginable loss. It set the stage for the epic confrontation at Stalingrad, where the tide of World War II would turn against Nazi Germany once and for all. Join us as we journey back to those pivotal months, uncovering the strategy, the human stories, and the crucial mistakes that changed the course of history. If you love exploring the hidden lessons of the past and want to see how a single decision can alter the fate of nations, make sure to like this video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful stories to life, stories that remind us how the echoes of history still shape the world we live in today. The thunderous momentum that had carried the German armies deep into Soviet territory began to falter as they approached the gates of Moscow. What had once been a breathtaking series of rapid advances now slowed to a crawl, the vaunted blitzkrieg losing the speed and precision that had made it so formidable in the early stages of the invasion. The initial confidence in a swift victory, fueled by weeks of stunning gains, began to erode as reality set in. The vast distances of the Russian heartland, underestimated from the very beginning, revealed themselves as an enemy as formidable as the Red Army itself. Supply convoys stretched across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain, and every mile further from the German frontier increased the difficulty of feeding, clothing, and arming the advancing troops. Trains struggled to keep up, fuel depots ran dry, and the once well-oiled machine of the Wehrmacht started to creak under the weight of its own ambition. As the autumn rains turned roads into endless stretches of thick, sucking mud, the German panzers, those sleek and deadly engines of blitzkrieg, found themselves bogged down in terrain that swallowed wheels and tracks alike. Soldiers who had grown used to swift, decisive movements now labored ankle-deep in freezing sludge, their progress slowed to a painful grind. Nature itself seemed to conspire against them, as if the land was defending its people with a silent but unyielding fury. Yet even as the weather worsened, the Soviet strategy proved equally punishing. The Red Army, having learned bitter lessons from the early disasters of the campaign, refused to give the enemy a straightforward fight. Instead, Stalin's forces and the civilian population carried out a scorched earth policy of ruthless efficiency. Villages were burned before the Germans arrived, railways torn apart, bridges demolished, and crops destroyed. Anything that could be of use to the invaders was systematically denied. The Wehrmacht, already stretched thin, found only emptiness, empty barns, empty wells, empty storehouses where they had counted on plunder to sustain their momentum. As October gave way to November, the infamous Russian winter arrived early and with a ferocity that no one in the German high command had adequately prepared for. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, and snowstorms swept across the plains in blinding sheets. Soldiers who had been issued uniforms suited for a short summer campaign found themselves ill-equipped for the brutal cold. Boots cracked, weapons jammed, and machinery froze solid. The slick oil in engines and guns congealed like tar, and tanks that had once roared across Europe sat immobile in drifts of ice and snow. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, while the bitter winds cut through every layer of cloth and leather, turning men into shivering shadows of their former selves. Fires for warmth were scarce and dangerous, for smoke-betrayed positions and dry fuel was nearly impossible to find. Hunger gnawed at the troops as supply trains, already overburdened, fell victim to partisan sabotage and the sheer impossibility of keeping pace with the front lines. Meanwhile, the Soviet defenders grew stronger. Reinforcements from the far reaches of the Soviet Union poured into the defense of Moscow. Troops hardened by the harsh climates of Siberia and the Far East. These fresh divisions, clothed in heavy winter gear and trained for the unforgiving conditions, provided a stark contrast to the exhausted and underdressed German soldiers. The Red Army had transformed from a force caught off guard in the early days of the invasion into a resilient and determined opponent. Their knowledge of the terrain, their capacity to endure the cold, and their unbroken morale turned the tide. Counterattacks launched under the cover of blizzards caught the Germans off balance, shattering the illusion of invincibility that had followed the Wehrmacht since the opening of the war. Within the German ranks, despair began to seep in as surely as the icy winds that howled through their makeshift shelters. What was meant to be a lightning war had devolved into a bitter contest of survival. The promises of swift triumph that Hitler had made to his generals now rang hollow against the brutal reality of the Eastern Front. Each day brought new hardships: fuel shortages, dwindling ammunition, and the relentless pressure of Soviet resistance. Officers struggled to maintain discipline among soldiers whose spirits were broken not by a single catastrophic defeat, but by the slow, grinding attrition of nature and enemy alike. The dream of capturing Moscow before the end of the year faded into the frozen horizon. Operation Barbarossa, once conceived as the masterstroke that would bring the Soviet Union to its knees, had transformed into a nightmare that consumed men and machines in equal measure. The very factors that Hitler had dismissed, distance, climate, and the will of the Soviet people, proved decisive. The German army, built for speed and shock, found itself locked in a war of endurance it was never designed to fight. The failure to take Moscow before the winter not only denied Germany a quick victory but also signaled a turning point in the entire conflict. From this moment forward, the Eastern Front would bleed the Wehrmacht of men, material, and morale, setting the stage for a long and costly struggle that would ultimately decide the fate of the war in Europe. In the frozen fields outside Moscow, the myth of German invincibility began to die. What had started as a calculated gamble became a lesson in hubris and miscalculation. The rapid advances that had once dazzled the world were now a distant memory, buried beneath layers of snow and the unyielding resistance of a nation that refused to be broken. The winter, the scorched earth, And the stretched supply lines did what no army alone could achieve. They stopped the Wehrmacht in its tracks and altered the course of history. The failure to seize Moscow before the onset of the bitter Russian winter should have prompted caution. But Hitler's ambition only grew more reckless as the months passed. Convinced that victory in the east was still within his grasp, he turned his gaze toward the oil-rich Caucasus and the city that bore the name of his greatest ideological enemy. Stalingrad. The logic was, at first glance, strategic. Germany's war machine was ravenous for fuel, and the vast oil fields of the Caucasus promised to secure the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht's tanks, aircraft, and trucks. At the same time, capturing Stalingrad would not only sever vital Soviet supply lines along the Volga River, but also deal a symbolic blow to the Soviet regime. For Hitler, the opportunity to shatter morale by taking the city named after Joseph Stalin was too tempting to resist. Yet in pursuing both goals at once, he set in motion a decision that would stretch his forces beyond their limits and alter the course of the war. By the summer of 1942, the Eastern Front, already a colossal expanse of mud, snow, and smoke, became even more complicated. Instead of concentrating his strength for a single decisive thrust, Hitler chose to divide his armies, sending one group south toward the Caucasus oil fields and the other toward Stalingrad. His generals, veterans of the brutal winter campaign and well aware of the punishing distances involved, warned him of the dangers. But Hitler, fueled by a mixture of overconfidence and ideological obsession, brushed aside their concerns. He believed the Red Army was broken and that the Soviet Union was teetering on the brink of collapse. To him, splitting the German forces was not a gamble but an inevitability, the next step toward total victory. The vast geography of the Soviet Union, however, had humbled invaders for centuries, and it was about to do so again. As the summer sun beat down, the German army once more surged forward across the steppe. At first, progress was swift. The southern thrust drove deep toward the Caucasus, eyeing the oil riches of Baku and Grozny, while the Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus advanced toward Stalingrad. But as the front widened, the strain on supply lines grew unbearable. Trains and trucks struggled to ferry fuel and ammunition across distances that defied even Germany's famed logistical discipline. Roads and railways became lifelines stretched to the breaking point. Fuel shortages began to slow the advance just as the Soviet defenders regrouped and fortified key positions. What had seemed a calculated maneuver began to reveal itself as a dangerous overextension. In the Caucasus, the dream of securing the oil fields turned into a grinding nightmare. Rugged mountains, fierce resistance, and endless supply problems sapped the strength of the German formations. They could see the oil-rich regions in the distance, but they could not reach them in force. Meanwhile, the drive on Stalingrad became a brutal, street-by-street struggle that consumed men and machines at a staggering rate. The city on the Volga, once considered just another strategic point, turned into a symbol of Soviet defense. Stalin ordered that it be held at any cost, and Soviet soldiers fought with a tenacity that stunned their enemies. Every building, every factory, every pile of rubble became a fortress. German troops who had raced across open plains now found themselves locked in hand-to-hand combat amid the ruins, where snipers lurked in every shadow and artillery fire never ceased. The decision to split the German forces now revealed its fatal flaw. The armies advancing into the Caucasus were too far south to support the Sixth Army at Stalingrad, and those fighting in the city were too heavily engaged to retreat or regroup. The vast distance between these two fronts made coordination nearly impossible, while Soviet commanders seized the opportunity to exploit the gap. As autumn returned and the first icy winds swept across the steppe, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive. Operation Runus encircled the German Sixth Army, trapping tens of thousands of soldiers inside Stalingrad. Cut off from relief and supplies, the once mighty force found itself besieged, its fate sealed by the very overconfidence that had driven the summer offensive. Inside the encirclement, conditions quickly descended into a nightmare. Food and ammunition dwindled as temperatures plunged far below freezing. Frostbite and disease spread, and soldiers who had once believed in a swift conquest now faced the bleak reality of starvation and annihilation. The Luftwaffe tried desperately to supply the trapped army by air, but the effort fell woefully short. Each day brought more casualties and more despair. Outside the pocket, German attempts to break through the Soviet lines failed repeatedly. Hitler refused to authorize a breakout, insisting that the Sixth Army hold its ground, turning what might have been a tactical withdrawal into a catastrophic loss. By February 1943, the once proud Sixth Army had been destroyed. General Paulus, promoted to Field Marshal in a final, futile attempt to compel him to fight to the last man, surrendered rather than sacrifice his remaining troops. The surrender at Stalingrad was more than a military defeat. It was a shattering psychological blow to the German war effort. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht, already weakened by the winter before Moscow, was now irrevocably broken. What had begun as a bid to secure vital resources and deliver a symbolic victory had instead drained Germany of its best soldiers, exposed the limits of its power, and handed the initiative to the Soviet Union. The decision to divide the German armies, born of hubris and a desire for both strategic gain and personal vindication, became one of the most consequential mistakes of the war. By seeking to seize both the Caucasus oil fields and Stalingrad simultaneously, Hitler fatally overextended his forces and set them on a path from which they could not recover. The consequences of that summer and winter in 1942-43 would reverberate through the remaining years of the conflict, as the Eastern Front turned irrevocably against Germany, and the dream of domination that had once seemed within Hitler's grasp slipped away into the snow and smoke of defeat. From August 1942, the war on the Eastern Front transformed into something the German High Command had never truly anticipated. As the battle for Stalingrad descended into a nightmare of savage urban combat that erased the advantages of Germany's once unstoppable mechanized army. The city on the Volga had already been battered by weeks of relentless Luftwaffe bombardment, its skyline reduced to a chaotic landscape of collapsed factories, gutted apartment blocks, and twisted steel. Streets that had once echoed with the sounds of industry and river commerce were now choked with rubble and smoke, turning every alleyway and courtyard into a potential trap. Tanks that had dominated the open plains now struggled to navigate a labyrinth of ruins, their speed and firepower blunted by debris and hidden ambushes. What had begun as a confident thrust toward a strategic prize became a slow, grinding struggle in which progress was measured not in miles, but in rooms, stairwells, and shattered walls. For the soldiers on both sides, Stalingrad became a vision of hell. German troops who had stormed across Europe in a series of lightning victories found themselves fighting block by block, floor by floor, against Soviet defenders who refused to yield a single inch. The Red Army had transformed the very skeleton of the city into a weapon. Factories were turned into fortresses, rubble into barricades, and every ruined building into a sniper's nest. The defenders moved like ghosts through the wreckage, striking swiftly and vanishing into the smoke, while artillery thundered without pause, shaking the ground and filling the air with dust. The Germans, accustomed to the sweeping maneuvers of blitzkrieg, now faced an enemy who fought not in open fields but in the shadows of destruction, where every doorway concealed danger and every heap of broken bricks could hide a deadly rifle barrel. The human cost of this struggle was beyond imagining. Soldiers lived and fought in cellars half filled with icy water, sleeping among the dead and subsisting on rations that grew smaller with each passing day. Hunger gnawed at every stomach. The meager supplies that reached the front lines were barely enough to keep men alive, and soldiers scavenged whatever they could find: rats, scraps of frozen bread, anything that might stave off starvation. The bitter Russian winter descended once again, bringing with it temperatures that plunged far below freezing. Breath turned to ice on beards and scarves. Weapons froze in men's hands. And the icy wind cut through the thin uniforms of the German soldiers like knives. The harsh cold was an enemy as implacable as any human foe, turning the Volga into a ribbon of solid ice and coating the ruins with a treacherous crust of snow. Above the ruins the Luftwaffe continued its assault, pounding the city with relentless bombing runs. But even the German Air Force could not break the Soviet will. Instead, the bombardment only deepened the devastation, creating yet more hiding places for the defenders and filling the air with an unending haze of smoke and fire. For the Soviets, the ruined city became an ally. Under the leadership of General Vasily Chukov, the Red Army embraced a brutal doctrine of close-quarters combat. They fought so near the enemy that German artillery and aircraft risked hitting their own men. This tactic, known among the soldiers as hugging the enemy, nullified the German advantage in heavy firepower and turned every encounter into a lethal duel at point-blank range. Knives, grenades, and even bare hands became weapons as men battled for each stairwell and trench. As the weeks dragged on, the psychological toll mounted. Sleep was a luxury few could afford. The constant thunder of artillery and the screams of the wounded became an unending background to life and death. Corpses lay frozen in the streets, too dangerous to retrieve, their stiff forms serving as grim reminders of what awaited those who faltered. The Germans, trapped in this maelstrom, discovered that their earlier victories had prepared them poorly for a war of attrition fought in the ruins of a city that refused to die. They came expecting a swift conquest and found instead an opponent whose determination hardened with every day of suffering. On the Soviet side, reinforcements continued to arrive across the frozen Volga, braving the deadly fire of German guns to bring fresh troops and supplies into the city. Civilians who had not fled joined in the defense, carrying ammunition, tending to the wounded, and sometimes taking up arms themselves. Stalin's order not a step back was more than rhetoric. It was a grim reality for those who fought in the streets of Stalingrad. To retreat was to die, and to fight was the only path to survival. The city, once a thriving industrial hub, became both tome and symbol, a place where the resolve of the Soviet people was forged in the fires of destruction. For the German soldiers, the dream of seizing Stalingrad as a swift and symbolic triumph turned into an ordeal without end. Their mechanized divisions, designed for lightning war, were reduced to infantry grinding through rubble, their tanks and artillery of little use in the twisted streets. Supply lines grew longer and more precarious, and the bitter cold tightened its grip. The very air seemed to conspire against them, carrying the acrid smoke of burning buildings and the metallic scent of blood. Each block gained was paid for in lives, and every inch of progress seemed to demand a sacrifice far greater than the prize was worth. By the time winter settled fully over the Volga, the battle for Stalingrad had become more than a fight for a city. It was a clash of wills, a contest not just of armies but of endurance and national spirit. The Germans, who once believed that their speed and firepower made them invincible, found themselves trapped in a struggle where neither could guarantee victory. The Soviets, battered but unbroken, turned their suffering into strength, drawing from the very ruins a determination that no bombardment could shatter. The mechanized might of the Wehrmacht, once feared across Europe, had been neutralized by a city reduced to rubble, and a people who would rather die than yield. The frozen ruins of Stalingrad had become the crucible of a turning point in the war, a place where famine, freezing weather, and relentless bombing tested the limits of human endurance and reshaped the destiny of nations. By November 1942, the city of Stalingrad had already become a scarred monument to human endurance, a place where months of unbroken combat had turned every street into a graveyard and every ruined building into a fortress. The German Sixth Army, once the spearhead of Hitler's ambition to crush Soviet resistance and secure the oil fields of the Caucasus, now found itself locked in a struggle that consumed men and machines faster than they could be replaced. As the bitter cold tightened its grip and the skies filled with smoke and ice, Soviet commanders were quietly preparing a counterstroke that would transform the battle from a brutal stalemate into a catastrophe for Germany. The Red Army, drawing strength from the vast reserves of the Soviet interior and emboldened by the iron determination of Stalin and his generals, had patiently built the forces necessary for a grand encirclement. Their plan, codenamed Operation Runus, aimed not merely to relieve the defenders within Stalingrad, but to trap the German invaders in the very ruins they had sought to claim. While the Sixth Army continued its grinding street battles along the Volga, convinced that victory lay only a few more assaults away, Soviet forces massed silently on the northern and southern flanks. These sectors were held not by the hardened Wehrmacht, but by Romanian division's troops who, brave as they were, lacked the equipment and manpower to resist a major offensive. It was here, in the open steppe beyond the city's shattered skyline, that the Soviets prepared to strike. Their deception was masterful. German intelligence, lulled by the belief that the Red Army had been bled dry, failed to anticipate the scale of the counteroffensive. Even as German soldiers struggled to stay warm in cellars and foxholes, and officers obsessed over capturing the last Soviet positions in the city, the trap was being set. On the morning of the 19th of November 1942, the silence of the frozen steppe erupted into a deafening roar. Soviet artillery unleashed a bombardment that shook the earth, and waves of infantry and armor surged forward through the snow. The Romanian defenses crumbled under the sheer weight of the assault, their lines buckling as Soviet tanks poured through the gaps. Within hours, the northern and southern thrusts began to race toward one another behind the German positions. The German High Command, caught off guard and slow to react, scrambled to mount a response. But the momentum was already irreversible. By 23 November, the two Soviet pincers met near the town of Kalach, sealing the ring of steel around Stalingrad and encircling more than 250,000 Axis soldiers. The once proud Sixth Army was suddenly cut off from all relief, its supply lines severed and its fate hanging by a thread. Inside the encirclement, panic began to spread. General Friedrich Paulus and his officers faced an impossible reality. They had been ordered by Hitler to hold their ground and had every expectation of eventual victory. Yet now they found themselves surrounded on all sides by a rejuvenated enemy. The bitter irony was unmistakable. The hunters had become the hunted. The encircled troops looked to the skies for salvation as the Luftwaffe attempted to mount an airlift. But the scale of the task was beyond even Germany's once formidable air force. Freezing winds and Soviet anti-aircraft fire turned each flight into a deadly gamble. Supplies that did manage to arrive were pitifully inadequate, barely a fraction of what was needed to sustain the army, let alone continue fighting. As the days turned into weeks, the conditions inside the pocket grew desperate. Food and fuel dwindled to almost nothing. Soldiers scraped ice from walls for water and boiled leather belts in a vain attempt to quiet their hunger. The bitter cold, which had already claimed so many during the previous winter outside Moscow, now returned with merciless force. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes, rifles froze solid, and the simple act of breathing sent knives of pain through lungs raw from smoke and freezing air. Disease spread rapidly in the crowded shelters, and the moans of the sick and dying became a constant companion to those still able to fight. The once proud Sixth Army, which had marched east with banners of victory, now faced the slow disintegration of both body and spirit. Beyond the ring, German efforts to break through the Soviet lines faltered again and again. Operation Winter Storm, a desperate attempt to relieve the trapped army, advanced toward the encirclement but was beaten back by fierce Soviet resistance and the same unforgiving weather that tormented those within. Polis. Awaiting orders. Received only Hitler's command. Stand fast. Surrender is forbidden. Yet every day the grip of the Red Army tightened, and every day the prospects for escape diminished. What had begun as a bold offensive to seize the resources of the Soviet Union now stood revealed as a colossal miscalculation, and the German soldiers knew it. Letters home, when they could be sent, carried not words of triumph but pleas for understanding and final farewells. For the Soviets, the encirclement was more than a tactical victory. It was a statement of defiance and a turning point in the war. Stalin and his generals had taken the initiative, demonstrating to the world that the Red Army, once derided as ill-prepared and poorly led, could plan and execute an operation of breathtaking scale and precision. The ring around Stalingrad was not merely a military maneuver. It was the symbol of a nation's resolve, and the beginning of the end for the invaders who had brought fire and death to their land. Each day that the Sixth Army remained trapped sapped German strength and morale across the entire Eastern Front, while lifting the spirits of the Soviet people and their allies. As the winter deepened and the siege dragged on, the fate of the encircled soldiers was sealed. They were cut off from supplies, from reinforcements, from hope itself, left to endure starvation and freezing cold while Soviet artillery pounded their positions without respite. The Red Army's encirclement of November 1942 had transformed Stalingrad from a battlefield into a giant trap, a place where the once mighty Wehrmacht found its power broken and its aura of invincibility shattered. From the moment the Soviet pincers closed, the outcome of the battle was no longer in doubt. What remained was only the slow, merciless unraveling of an army and the beginning of a strategic shift that would carry the war toward Germany's eventual defeat. By the time the bitter winter of early 1943 gripped the banks of the Volga, the long and desperate struggle for Stalingrad had reached its final, crushing act. Months of unbroken combat had transformed the once thriving industrial city into a maze of skeletal factories and shattered apartment blocks, each ruin soaked with the memories of countless soldiers who had fought and fallen. Inside that bleak landscape, what remained of the German Sixth Army, once the pride of Hitler's Eastern campaign, was reduced to a gaunt and hollow-eyed remnant. Men who had been hardened by years of war but were now ravaged by hunger, exhaustion, and an unforgiving cold that gnawed through every layer of their threadbare uniforms. Their officers, many of whom had entered the campaign confident in a swift and decisive victory, now moved among their troops with an air of grim resignation, knowing that no relief would come and that every hour was simply a slow march toward the inevitable. Encircled since the Soviet counteroffensive in November, the Sixth Army had become an island of desperation. Its supply lines severed and every effort at resupply thwarted by the Red Army's relentless control of the surrounding steppe. Luftwaffe pilots braved fierce anti-aircraft fire to drop meager crates of food and ammunition. But the deliveries were a drop of water on a blazing fire, scarcely enough to keep the men alive for another day. The soldiers huddled in makeshift bunkers dug into frozen rubble, surviving on thin rations and the faint hope that somehow the high command in Berlin would send an army to break the ring. But those hopes dimmed with each passing week as the Soviets tightened their grip, their artillery pounding the shrinking German perimeter until the very earth trembled beneath the defenders' feet. Inside these frozen pockets of resistance, illness and frostbite claimed almost as many lives as bullets. Medical supplies had long since run out, leaving field surgeons to operate with crude improvisations, their breath freezing in the frigid air as they worked under the dim light of flickering lanterns. Letters from home stopped arriving. The men no longer spoke of families or of returning to Germany, for the notion of survival itself had become a distant dream. The great army that had once surged across the steppes with the confidence of conquerors now resembled a starving host of phantoms, haunted by the spectre of a fate they could no longer escape. In the command posts, the mood was no less bleak. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, promoted by Hitler in a final gesture of defiance, understood the hopelessness of their position. The order from Berlin was unequivocal. Stand fast. Resist. Fight to the last man. Yet the reality on the ground was unmistakable. Ammunition was dwindling. The soldiers were too weak to mount any meaningful counterattack, and the cold was an enemy no weapon could repel. Paulus, once a meticulous strategist, found himself confronting the limits of human endurance and the terrible weight of his responsibility. He knew that to continue fighting was to condemn tens of thousands of his men to meaningless death, yet to surrender was to defy the very regime that had elevated him. When the final Soviet assault pressed inward, and the city's remaining pockets of resistance collapsed one after another, Paulus faced the decision that would define not just his own legacy but the fate of the entire Sixth Army. On the first days of February, after nights of ceaseless bombardment and with no hope of relief, he agreed to lay down arms. Approximately 90,000 soldiers, among them 24 generals, emerged from the ruins to become prisoners of war, their faces pale and hollow from months of suffering. They marched through the snow under the watchful eyes of Soviet guards, leaving behind the lifeless city that had swallowed so many of their comrades. The capitulation of Stalingrad sent shockwaves through Europe and beyond. What had begun as an ambitious drive to secure the oil fields of the Caucasus and the strategic gateway of the Volga ended in catastrophe, a reversal so profound that it altered the entire trajectory of the war. The myth of the Nazi war machine's invincibility was shattered in those final days of winter. Nations that had watched Germany's earlier triumphs with a mix of fear and resignation now saw that the Colossus could bleed, and that its armies could be broken. For the Soviets, the victory was more than a military success. It was a surge of national pride and an unshakable proof that the tide of the conflict had begun to turn. News of the surrender rippled through German ranks across the Eastern Front, and with it came a subtle but irreversible change. Soldiers who had once marched with iron certainty began to feel the creeping shadow of doubt. In Berlin, the defeat was a wound to prestige that no propaganda could fully conceal. Hitler's grand designs for domination of the East lay in ruins. His carefully cultivated aura of strategic genius now questioned even among those closest to him. The psychological blow of Stalingrad reached beyond the immediate loss of men and material. It pierced the heart of the regime's confidence and signaled to the world that the long and bloody struggle for Europe would not end in swift German victory. For the men who trudged into Soviet captivity, the ordeal was far from over. Few would ever return to their homeland, and those who did would carry scars visible and unseen for the rest of their lives. Yet their surrender marked a pivotal moment in history, a turning point when the momentum of a vast and brutal conflict shifted irreversibly. The shattered streets of Stalingrad bore silent witness to this change, their ruins standing as a testament to human endurance and the terrible cost of ambition. In the cold, unyielding winter of 1943, the once mighty Sixth Army's downfall became the symbol of a wider unraveling. The moment when the tide of the Second World War began to flow with gathering strength toward eventual Allied victory. The surrender of the German Sixth Army in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad did far more than decide the fate of a single city. It changed the entire rhythm of the war. In the months that followed, the echoes of that defeat rippled across the Eastern Front and beyond, altering the confidence of nations and reshaping the calculations of generals and statesmen. Until Stalingrad, the German war machine had seemed nearly unstoppable, an iron force that had swept from Poland to France and deep into the heart of the Soviet Union with an efficiency that left even its enemies grudgingly awed. But in the winter of 1943 the illusion cracked. What had once looked like inevitable victory now appeared fragile, and the aura of invincibility that had surrounded Hitler's armies dissolved into the cold air over the Volga. For the soldiers of the Red Army, and the civilians who had endured months of unimaginable hardship. The triumph was more than a military success. It was a profound affirmation that the sacrifices of their nation were not in vain. From the charred factories and shattered apartment blocks of Stalingrad came a surge of belief that the tide had truly turned. The Soviet people, who had withstood famine, relentless bombardment, and the searing pain of loss, now felt a collective strength that no enemy could extinguish. Across the vast territory of the Soviet Union, the news spread like wildfire through villages that had sent their sons to the front, through factories that worked day and night to feed the war effort. For them, Stalingrad was not just a victory. It was proof that endurance and unity could outlast even the most ruthless assault. This psychological transformation was matched by a strategic shift just as dramatic. The German High Command, which had once dictated the pace and direction of the war, found itself for the first time forced into a defensive posture. The failure of the Stalingrad campaign shattered Germany's grand plan to secure the oil-rich Caucasus and choke off Soviet industry along the Volga. The Reich's armies, which had once raced forward with unstoppable momentum, were now compelled to hold the ground they had taken and to brace themselves for the counterblows that everyone knew would come. The loss of nearly 300,000 men killed, captured, or wounded was not simply a military statistic. It was a wound that could not easily be healed. Equipment, experienced officers, and the confidence of the rank and file had been drained away, leaving gaps that no amount of hurried recruitment could fully replace. As the Red Army regrouped and strengthened, the balance of initiative shifted decisively. The Soviets, once reeling under the weight of German offensives, began to seize the moment, pushing forward with renewed vigor and a clear sense that the enemy was not infallible. The coming months would see this newfound momentum tested in battles that would confirm beyond doubt the change in fortune. Among these, the vast clash at Kursk in the summer of 1943 would stand as the definitive proof. There, in rolling fields of wheat and black earth, the largest tank battle in history erupted. A contest of steel and fire where the might of Germany's armored divisions met the entrenched and meticulously prepared defenses of the Soviet front. The Germans had hoped that a swift, decisive blow at Kursk could regain the initiative lost at Stalingrad, cutting a great salient in the Soviet lines and restoring the momentum of earlier campaigns. But the Soviets, fully aware of these plans through their increasingly effective intelligence networks, had transformed the Kursk salient into a fortress of minefields, antiques, and interlocking defensive positions. When the German assault began in July, it encountered a wall of fire and resistance that even their most formidable tanks could not overcome. Days of brutal fighting wore down the attackers, while Soviet reserves waited to strike. When the counteroffensive came, it was overwhelming. By the time the battle ended, the German forces had not only failed to achieve their objectives, but had suffered losses they could not easily replace. Kursk was not merely another Soviet victory. It was the confirmation of a new reality. The Red Army had demonstrated that it could not only withstand the might of the Wehrmacht, but also defeat it in open battle. From that moment onward, Germany was never again able to launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. The long, grinding retreat toward the west had begun, a retreat that would ultimately end in the ruins of Berlin. For the Allies in the west, Stalingrad and then Kursk signaled more than just shifts in the military balance. They were turning points in global perception. Governments that had once doubted the Soviet Union's ability to hold out against the Nazi onslaught now saw in these victories the evidence of a partner capable of not only surviving but striking decisive blows. This recognition would shape diplomatic relations and the coordination of Allied strategy, paving the way for greater cooperation that would eventually culminate in the opening of a second front in Europe. For Germany, the psychological blow was immense. Stalingrad had already torn away the cloak of invincibility. But Kursk sealed the verdict. The myth of a war that could be won through rapid, crushing offensives had died. Soldiers and officers alike began to feel the creeping weight of inevitability. The dawning understanding that they were now fighting not for conquest, but for survival. The confidence that had carried them across half a continent was replaced by a grim determination simply to hold what they could and delay the advance of a relentless foe. In the great sweep of history, Stalingrad stands as the moment when the axis of the war shifted. It was there that the momentum of a global conflict turned decisively against Germany. And it was there that the seeds of ultimate Allied victory were sown. The battle's legacy was not only in the shattered armies and the ruined city, but in the transformation of hope and fear across the world. Kursk confirmed what Stalingrad had begun. The Nazi drive for domination had been broken, and the long road to their final defeat had become unstoppable. When the frozen ruins of Stalingrad finally fell silent and the smoke of Kursk drifted away, the momentum of the war had irreversibly changed. From that point onward, the Red Army no longer fought merely to survive. It marched westward with an ever-growing determination to reclaim every inch of lost ground and carry the fight all the way to the heart of the enemy. In the years that followed, the map of Europe itself became the canvas upon which this transformation unfolded. Villages and cities once swallowed by the German advance were retaken one after another. Across the vast plains of Ukraine, through the battered streets of Warsaw, and across the Vistula and Oder rivers, the Soviets pressed forward like a tide that could not be turned. Each advance was more than a military victory. It was a symbol of the endurance that had been forged in the dark days of 1941 and 1942, a testament to the will of millions who had endured unimaginable hardship and refused to yield. By the winter of 1944, the initiative firmly belonged to the Allies, while American, British, and Canadian forces were pushing from the west after the landings in Normandy. The Soviet armies hammered relentlessly from the east. Their combined pressure left Germany encircled, its armies stretched thin and its economy straining under the weight of total war. For the German people, what had once been promised as a lightning victory had become a desperate struggle to delay the inevitable. Towns that had been transformed into fortresses fell one by one under the coordinated assaults of Allied forces. Soviet artillery thundered across the plains of Eastern Europe, while in the west, Allied bombers darkened the skies over German cities. The reach that had once seemed destined for domination was collapsing under the force of two converging fronts. By April 1945, the Red Army stood at the gates of Berlin. The journey that had begun in the ashes of Stalingrad reached its dramatic conclusion in the streets of the German capital. Fierce fighting raged among the shattered buildings and underground tunnels, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The relentless Soviet advance, combined with the Allied push from the west, brought an end to a conflict that had scarred the world. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally, and the war in Europe came to its long-awaited close. Yet victory did not bring simple peace. The defeat of Nazi Germany reshaped Europe in ways no one could fully predict. From the ruins emerged two superpowers whose rivalry would define the next half-century. The Soviet Union, having borne the heaviest losses and achieved the greatest victories on the Eastern Front, established its influence across Eastern Europe, installing governments that would remain tied to Moscow for decades. To the west, the United States, whose industrial might and military support had been critical to the Allied triumph, stood as a counterbalance. The fragile wartime alliance that had united Washington, London, and Moscow began to fray almost immediately, replaced by suspicion and the geopolitical chess match that would come to be known as the Cold War. The shadow of Stalingrad and the long march to Berlin hung over this new era. The battlefields of the Second World War had not only decided the fate of nations, but had also drawn the lines of a new and uneasy balance of power. The devastation was almost beyond comprehension. millions dead, cities in families displaced. Yet from the rubble, the post-war world took shape. Europe was divided into spheres of influence, and the ideological struggle between East and West would dominate global politics for generations. Looking back, the journey from Hitler's bold gamble in 1941 to the Soviet flag flying over the Reichstag in 1945 is a reminder of how swiftly the course of history can change. It is a story of ambition and overreach, of courage and sacrifice, and of the immense human cost of global conflict. Stalingrad, Kursk, and the relentless Soviet advance were not merely chapters in a military history book. They were turning points that continue to echo in our present day. Thank you for joining us as we retrace this extraordinary saga of resilience and transformation. If you found this story illuminating, if it deepened your understanding of how these events shaped the world we live in today, please show your support like this video. Share it with friends who are passionate about history, and subscribe to our channel. Your engagement helps us continue to bring the past to life, uncovering the lessons that remind us why history matters and why the choices of yesterday still guide the possibilities of tomorrow.